What class should I, it's gonna be Druid. Yep, yeah, it's Druid. Ladies, gentlemen, and adventurers of all ages, with the proper full release of Baldurs Gate 3 right around the corner, I bet a lot of you who are going to play the game properly for the first time now have a few big questions that you need to work through before release, and the biggest of these, the ones that you'll have to choose the earliest in your time with the game, are what class and race should you play? The simple answer, what looks fun to you, and then go with it. But in case that doesn't answer your questions enough, today I'm going to give you a general breakdown of the class fantasies for every class. We'll talk a bit about the subclasses associated with each of them, a couple of the mechanics as well, and we'll talk about the various races as well. 3 important notes as we head into the meat of this then. First, race doesn't have a negative effect being paired with any class anymore. In early access for the game, each race had stats that were attached to them, default stats and maximum stats, and so you may have heard things leading into the launch that if you wanted to be a wizard, you couldn't be a drow elf because it was a bad idea because you just couldn't get particularly high intelligence. But that's just no longer a thing. At launch, they've done away with this concept. Any race can have any stats, meaning generally speaking, you really can just play whatever class and race combination that you want to. It won't limit you at all. These days, the main deciding factor for which race you should play is more about the role play of it all than anything else. While they do still have some unique features, such as some races just having access to dark vision, some simply not. That said, while you can look through these features yourself while creating your character and make the decision then, I just wanted to make a big point of mentioning early on here that race no longer limits your class choice the way that it did in early access, and so there just isn't a whole lot of thought that you need to put into which race you're going to play before it comes out, other than what you think is fun. So honestly, go with that. The second big note is multi-classing. Starting pretty early on, you can actually spec into multiple classes to sort of double dip into multiple playstyles and multiple sets of abilities. Generally, this will only be effective up to a certain point. You really never want to take more than 3 levels in your secondary class at most, but the point here is that if you are really struggling to pick between 2 classes, you can actually genuinely just sort of mash them together and do a class it up, have some fun. The result will generally be a bit weaker than one class with its sole focus, as far as genuine output at least, but it also means you'll have a lot more options, a lot more variety, and a more balanced experience that affords you more variety in combat itself. Think of it like becoming a jack of all trades, but a master of none. The final note before diving in properly is class specialization, subclasses. Every class has a number of these, most of them having 3 options, with the exception of Paladin having a semi-secret 4th choice, Clerics having 7 choices, and Wizards having 8 whole different subclasses they can specialize in. The big deal with these though is that you can actually respec relatively easily within the game within your class, and so if there are multiple subclasses that interest you within a class, don't worry quite as much about that. As long as you chose the right overall class for you, you can swap around and mess with different subclasses without much of an issue. So instead we'll go over the general concept of the overarching class and talk about what these subclasses can do for the most part here. First up we have Barbarian, which as a class is pretty straightforward, what you would expect based on the name. The combat in Baldurs Gate 3 is very much based off of the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition system, so those who have played D&D recently will feel pretty at home with these general options. Barbarian is essentially your big beefcake melee friend, not using heavy armor but able to take a lot of punishment through pure physical prowess. They can enrage to reduce incoming physical damage and gain notable damage bonuses themselves. They charge, they jump, they slam with big weapons, and they specialize a bit differently depending on the subclass. Barbarian in this game has access to 3 subclasses. The Berserker, which is a classic barbarian concept, diving in, big angry guy. These can even throw full-on enemies if they are small enough if you want to use them as weapons, which is incredible. The Wild Heart subclass lets you embody the spirit of one of 5 animals at a time, gaining some of their traits. And then finally is the Wild Magic subclass, a martial and magic mixed experience with some elements of randomness as well, being wild magic based around chaos. After that, let's talk about the Druid. For all intents and purposes, this is your nature magic user in various ways. Druids have multiple different class fantasy concepts, and all of them are actually represented quite well individually in the game, with your actual focus depending on your subclass. All Druids get access to a lot of spells, and Druids are considered a prepared spellcaster, meaning that you gain knowledge of a lot of spells that you could use once you gain the appropriate level, but can only actually choose to have a few of them available at any given time to use between rests. Druid spells include anything from conjuring vines, calling wild animals, or even insects to help you in combat, or even things like earthquakes at a higher level. The other big Druid mechanic is called Wild Shape, which is the ability to transform into various animal forms in which their stats will overtake your own, and you will essentially just become that animal in combat if you choose to do so. The choices for Wild Shape in early access are Bear, which essentially just turns you into a walking tank, Wolf, which lets you either buff allies or debuff enemies, Badger, with the ability to burrow underground, Spider, which can trap enemies in webs and disable their movement, and Cat, which lets you avoid aggro from enemies as well as literally just meow to distract people. Essentially, this is a stealth form. It's worth mentioning that the devs stated there will likely be more forms in this as well in the full game, so this is just a taste of what's on offer. As for the subclasses for Druid, they are actually quite simple to get across. Circle of the Land gives you an enhanced focus on the spellcasting side of the class, Circle of the Moon gives you an enhanced focus on the shape-shifting side of the class, and then finally we have the Circle of the Spore, which is very heavily focused around fungus, spores, and decay, as that is all part of the Circle of Life, and thus fits in with the general concept of Druids. After that we have the Fighter, which are viewed as the greatest of martial fighters. Essentially, these are characters who have trained their whole life in their specific fighting style to simply become incredibly potent with it. They take this knowledge into battle, and they win. All fighters get to pick from a list of fighting styles which are essentially a focus on your actual type of combat, these being archery, defense if you want a bit more AC, dueling if you just want to use one weapon, great weapon fighting if you want a big weapon, protection, and two-weapon fighting if you like dual wielding. Fighters also gain the ability to get an extra full-on action on one turn per rest, so not often, but enough to make a big difference in important fights. Aside from that, a lot of fighters' uniqueness comes from your various martial archetypes, which are your subclasses. The choices that you have at launch are Battle Master, which has advanced combat maneuvers that you can use on occasion depending on the amount of superiority dice that you have. This lets you engage in, well, things that are just a bit more complex than literal slashes, doing things like menacing attack to try and fear your target, pushing attack to also move them, rally to give friendly creatures bonus HP, all that type of thing. The second subclass choice is Eldritch Knight, which is a sort of magic and martial mixed experience. You can learn abjuration and evocation magic, and at higher levels you even get the ability to cast both cantrips and do weapon attacks in the same turn. The third subclass, which wasn't a part of the early access, is the Champion, which is essentially all about increasing the reliability of critical hits. As a default, a critical hit will only happen if you roll a 20, which is a 5% chance. Champions immediately make that double the chance, making it a 19 or a 20 that counts as a crit, and they also get to pick a second fighting style later on, allowing you to focus on, say, both archery and dual wielding melee weapons if you would like to. Then we have the Ranger. This as a class is meant to be a top tier scout, a tracker of beasts and men with a deep connection to nature. For the most part, these tend to be archers. You get a favorite enemy type, which unlike in D&D actually gives you a specific proficiency bonus and also a bonus effect, either on existing abilities that you would already have or even giving you access to certain cantrips that you otherwise wouldn't get. Rangers can also pick a fighting style like fighters do, but it is limited to only archery, defense, dueling, or two-weapon fighting, leaning heavily in a dexterity type direction. Then we of course have the subclasses for this as well, the first of which is Hunter. This subclass gets to focus on different combat scenarios, but also gains the ability at later levels to just attack multiple enemies that are within a 10-foot radius of each other, making it really good at attacking tons of different enemies at once. Then there is Beastmaster, which gets a more permanent animal companion to follow you around as a pet, and a friend that helps out in combat properly. Then the final subclass, again not in early access so the information is sort of limited, is Gloomstalker. Essentially this is a stealth-focused ranger built around getting to the right spot on the battlefield at the right time to initiate combat. This is sort of like the rogue of the rangers, to put it simply. On which note, there is also the class that is, just the rogue. This is a classic concept as far as class fantasy goes. Bandits, outlaws, pirates, assassins, thieves, rogue fits in as all of these types of characters if you want to roleplay that type of thing. The most important overarching mechanic for rogue is sneak attack. This gives you bonus damage against any enemy that you have advantage over for any reason, whether this be initiating combat while unseen or flanking maneuvers mid-combat. The rogue also has 3 subclasses like most other classes that will decide how you specialize your character. The first of these is the Arcane Trickster. This is a mixed martial and magic subclass gaining access to some wizard spells and cantrips such as Mage Hand, which for this subclass is actually invisible as well and can do things like picking locks. For the most part, you'll be taking advantage of illusion and enchantment spells with this subclass to really boost what rogues are already pretty good at. Then we have the Thief subclass. These gain an extra bonus action, resistance to falling damage, and generally just focused around boosting the stealthiness and ability to manipulate the battlefield just a little bit more. The final subclass, which again was not in early access, so limited information once more, but this is the Assassin. This one is very much just focused on killing power, giving you advantage against any enemy that is not yet attacked in combat, and it also makes attacks on creatures not yet in combat be a guaranteed critical hit. All of that simply adds up to a lot of offensive strength, and that's essentially what the subclass is all about. Then we have the Sorcerer class. At a glance, if you are not familiar with the difference between a sorcerer and a wizard in D&D terms, this might be a bit confusing, but a simple way to remember the difference is that wizards have access to a much much larger variety of potential spells, giving them a lot more utility and options, whereas sorcerers tend to focus on maximizing the effectiveness of a handful of spells instead. A lot of the uniqueness of this class is based on the way that their spellcasting system works. Unlike most casters, a sorcerer doesn't have to prepare spells, they can simply cast any spell that they know if they want to, but they of course learn less spells than the prepared spell classes do to compensate. Then you have the sorcery points and meta magic mechanics. Sorcery points are either used to restore spell slots, allowing you to cast more often between rests, or to cast meta magic, which are exceptionally enhanced versions of the spells that you know, including things like doubling the number of enemies that a single target spell can affect and letting you choose a second target for that. Aside from this, a lot of sorcerers' experience is determined by their subclass, and the first one to stop on is Draconic Bloodline. This essentially is just you decided that one of the various types of dragon were part of your ancestry. It gives you various bonuses in relation to this, such as increasing the damage that you do and resistance that you have with specific elements which are tied to the color of dragon that you choose in character creation. A lot of your gameplay will be based around maximizing your output with your chosen damage type. The second subclass is Wild Magic, essentially just based around chaos at every point. Every time you cast a spell, there is a roll to see if a random bonus effect happens. This effect can be either wildly positive for you or even a massive negative to you. So it's not all sunshine and rainbows, but it really adds some craziness to experience in general, and this is undoubtedly a really fun choice if you don't mind the randomness of it all, sometimes coming up to bite you in the butt. Then the third subclass, again not available in early access, is the Storm Sorcerer. This is essentially a more elemental focused sorcerer and has a lot of good potential in the game for maximizing certain classic Larian mechanics such as shocking puddles like you could in Divinity. It can arc out an extra lash of damage when dealing lightning or thunder damage too. This is mostly just a lightning focused sorcerer. After that we have the Bard, your charismatic traveler. Whether they be a musician, an actor, or a performer who knows tricks with swords, these are all about being flashy and interesting with a magical flair. Bards have a certain number of bardic inspiration die based on their charisma modifier, and you can use this as a bonus action to add an extra dice roll bonus to an ally's rolls. Bards also get half of their proficiency bonus even on skills that they aren't proficient in, and that tied with being a charisma heavy class makes them an excellent choice if you just want a character who is good at talking their way out of any situation, or into some situations that you'd actually want to be a part of too. Then we of course have the subclasses for bards as well to give them their own unique flair. You have the College of Lore, which lets you have even more skill proficiencies and gives you the cutting words ability, which is fun, turning the literal insults that you bellow into debuffs on enemies. College of Valor gives you armor and weapon proficiencies, giving you access to whatever weapon that you could want really, and lets you inspire the damage rolls of your allies as well. College of Swords we will have on full release of the game, and classically this is similar to College of Valor, but with much more of a focus on buffing yourself rather than allies, and with a much more limited pool of proficient weapons that they can use as a spellcasting focus, but generally they tend to be a bit more potent as well. Then we have the Monk class, and this will be totally new to the game on launch, so most of our information is just based on the D&D 5e version of Monks. It's not been a part of early access at all. These are a martial focused class with a bit of magical elements in them too. They have a heavy focus on less massive damage per hit done, but with a higher number of attacks than most do, and they focus around the key mechanic, which is a resource that you can only expend so much of per rest, giving you access to enhanced abilities such as Flurry of Blows to make a second attack when you would normally only be doing one, or Stunning Strike to take enemies out of combat for a turn. Monk also has 3 subclasses, the Way of the Open Hand, which focuses on the martial prowess of the class, giving you more ways to use your key strikes to your advantage, such as Flurry of Blows, also being able to knock enemies prone, push them to another location, or disable its ability to make reactions. This subclass also gains a self-heal. Then there is the Way of the Shadow, which is essentially stealth and ambush monk, gaining access to shadow arts. This spends ki to duplicate some of your spells, and you can even teleport you up to 60 feet between dimly lit areas, also giving you advantage on attacks in the same turn when you do so. Then the final subclass is Way of the Four Elements, which dives much more, as you might expect, into elemental and magical sides of the monk, letting you spend ki to do things like extend your melee range with a fiery snake that comes out of your fist, as an example. After that, then we have the Warlock. This is a class that has a pact with powerful beings, a lot of the time tending to be beings viewed negatively by most of society. Warlocks are a magical class, but their spellcasting is actually known as pact magic. This limits the number of spells a Warlock can actually use at a time, but also gives them the ability to restore spell slots on a short rest instead of a long one. There's a lot of complexity to this class and uniqueness between their spellcasting mechanics, but as with most classes, a lot of the individuality comes from the subclasses themselves. For Warlock, this is dependent on the type of creature your pact is with. If your pact is with a fiend or a devil, they will tend to give you spells that focus a lot more on just actually damaging enemies and causing a lot of destruction, causing pain. If your pact is with the Great Old Ones, you will get access to much more psychic type abilities that specifically allow you to mess with the minds of those around you. And if your pact is with an Archfey, it'll be much more about buffs and debuffs than straight up damage, things like charm, fear, sleep, those types of mechanics. With that then, let's talk about the Paladin. For the most part, this is your classic warrior of light devoted to the gods and to just goodness in general, spending a lot of time in melee combat but also mixing it up with some magic. Paladins also gain access to a few fighting style choices, being defense, dueling, great weapon fighting, or protection. As for the specifics of the gameplay, pretty much all of Paladin is decided by your subclass, which are your various choices of oath. And Paladin actually technically has 4, and they have a big impact on your role-playing in the game too. This isn't just the way that you fight, it's the way that you act. By that, I mean that each of these oaths holds you to a particular standard, needing you to stick to the actions that oath would want you to make. If you stray from that path, if you do something that doesn't match your oath, this is when you would actually unlock the 4th subclass, which is Oathbreaker. It's an entirely different thing, completely separate, and it's actually pretty evil and mean, but it's lovely to have in the game. Starting from the top then, we have the Oath of Devotion. Most of this oath itself is about acting with honor, protecting the weak, and pursuing the greater good for the world. This gives you the ability to coat your weapon with radiant energy, interact with the undead, or at higher levels provide an aura around you that keeps allies from being charmed in any way. Oath of the Ancients is more about being merciful and preserving the sanctity of life in general and the beauty of nature, less about good and bad, more just about trying to keep everything alive if you have the choice. This subclass gets access to healing effects and interactions with nature, such as trapping enemies in vines rather than doing damage to them directly, and its aura gives elemental resistance to you and nearby allies as well. The Oath of Vengeance is a lot more about exacting justice upon those who act negatively upon the world. Essentially, the sort of warmonger of the Paladin, bringing pain upon those who deemed deserving of it, and focusing a lot on just pure damage, and instead of getting an aura, they get the ability to move after performing an attack of opportunity. Then we have the Oathbreaker, the edgy Paladin. This subclass can control undead, deal necrotic damage, and apply fear to enemies. For all intents and purposes, this is the evil Paladin, basically, and it gets pretty nasty in the best of ways. Then we have the Cleric class. Unlike a Paladin who swears an oath and receives power based on their own devotion to this oath, a Cleric directly receives their power from a god or a deity themselves, being in direct communication with their god or deity and doing their will, whatever it may be. Clerics are also proper spellcasters, gaining access to high-level spells, and while they are a prepared spellcaster, they actually never have to technically learn new spells. They simply learn all the spells that they could use as you level up, and you just prepare the ones that you actually plan to use. Past that, there are of course the subclasses or domains in this case, and Cleric has 7 full-on subclasses, and a big part of that is simply that different subclasses get access to either more powerful versions of existing spells, or simply get certain spells much easier than you otherwise would. With that then, let's go over a vague overview of the various subclasses. There is the Domain of Life. This gains heavy armor proficiency, as well as more healing spells than most clerics, and just become more proficient at healing. The Domain of Light gets access to the Light cantrip for free just at the start, and generally will become quite the strong offensive spellcaster as you move on. More of a ranged player. The War and Tempest domains both give you access to heavy armor, along with martial weapon proficiency, both being great subclasses for more melee combat focuses, with the War domain having much more of a focus on the weapon itself, and the Tempest domain much more of a focus on lightning and thunder damage. The Domain of Knowledge gains extra proficiencies because, well, it's about knowledge, and then there's the Trickery domain, based around deception and illusion magic, and stealth essentially mostly just about causing mischief as a whole. All of these various domains get access to a number of spells befitting their general concept, so really the Cleric just has a ton of potential variety, and you should pick based on the class fantasy that sounds fun to you if you want to play one. Then the final class today is the Wizard here. This is arguably just the most classic fantasy archetype as a whole. Tons of powerful magic of any kind that you can imagine, and that's what's truly at the core of this class in the game too. As a wizard, as far as your class fantasy, you are essentially just someone completely obsessed with knowledge, especially knowledge about spells themselves. You collect this knowledge, you practice the various kinds of magic yourself, and while in combat, it can make you look incredibly stylish with all these different spells pouring out of you. Outside of combat, though, Wizard is expected to be very studious and well-read, not purposely looking cool just for the sake of it, so much as just looking cool as a result of what they have spent painstaking hours learning. As far as the actual gameplay, Wizards will know more spells than pretty much anyone else. You can get a bunch of cantrips and early access to a number of proper high-level spells. Wizards are based on prepared spells, so while you may know a ton of spells, you can actually only use a few of these at any given time. That said, Wizards do wind up with the most general spell slots at high level. Wizards also get the Arcane Recovery mechanic, which lets them restore a small number of spell slots when out of combat, even without the need for a proper rest. Aside from this, everything else is based around your subclass. Wizards are a bit funky, as well you can dip into any school of magic that you want to. Your subclass essentially just chooses any one of these 8 schools of of magic as your absolute focus, the one that you know the most about, and are therefore the most effective while using. They get lowered cost transcribing scrolls from their chosen school of magic, and also augmentations to the spells that you use from that school of magic that specifically boost their power. For all intents and purposes, all wizards are similar in theory, but the real differences will come on which school of magic that you choose to focus on with your subclass, which is why there are 8 different ones. They don't change a massive amount on a base mechanical level, but the actual playstyle varies greatly depending on your main focus of spell type. And that's it then, everyone. This has been a pretty long video, and I tried to keep things as concise as I could without leaving out overly important information. I really hope this helps you out making your decision as far as what you want to play in Baldurs Gate 3 when the game officially releases in just a few days. Again, this is the most important decision of your journey, so you want to get it right. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.